Okay, so Danny sent the first couple of questions, and the first one is kind of just like an overall, we're not going to talk about like specific, but, we talked about last time that this is the education portion of our journey, that you read the book and then the next step is to do something, whatever that means to you, that you can apply all of this that you're learning to your life, whether that's something proactive or, you're just kind of ready for certain things when they come up, like certain conversations or ways that you can help people in life. But the question that Danny put was just, how did this book make you feel? Because I've talked to some people about the book, and there's the uncomfortable feeling, but then there's also the emotions of reading some of the personal stories about Ijeoma's life and her brother, and how, they were treated in school and by people. And also, I think, not everyone reads the whole book and nods their head. There's moments where you're like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if I'm on board with that. So I'm just wondering if anybody has any thoughts just of emotions, how this made you feel. Danny, you had a couple of thoughts if you want to kick it off.
Yeah, I think the first one, there's a level of shame that I felt. And I think some of that is, I think it relates to thinking so starkly that I've always thought about myself as someone who is conscious of race and understands the position of privilege that I come from. And I think maybe as much because of the circumstances, but reading her words, like I felt very strongly like there have been opportunities that I've had to do more that I haven't. And is that really being true to my values? I do think of myself as someone who is an advocate or wants to be an ally. And I think of a lot of times in which my actions have come up short in that regard, or where I've been silent, and that question of silence is violence. I think that's too simplified, but there's a level of shame that I wasn't more active. And then I think the strongest emotional impact I had were the stories of children, whether it was the 5-year-old who had the difficult day at school and his mother didn't know it's where she's talking about the school to prison pipeline, or Ijeoma and her brother being out at Gold Bar and the kids chanting on the school bus. That pain or the lack, like that there was just an innocence that their childhood didn't have that I took for granted, that made me, I felt that was probably made me the saddest. So I think those were two of the overwhelming emotions, two of the stronger emotions I felt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt the sadness as well, definitely, with the personal stories. And I think, I think it was a smart choice for her to tell some personal stories and not just make it more of a handbook, because that's kind of how you get people on board, is hearing people's real life stories. I mean, everyone's heard about the politician who is, super Republican and very anti-gay, and then his son comes out and all of a sudden he's not as homophobic anymore. I mean, everyone kind of needs somebody in their life, like a personal example, whether it's in your life or you read about it, to connect, like the human connection to really kind of get on board with a movement. I think so. I'm glad that she did that. But yeah, the story of her and her brother going out to Gold Bar and staying with friends it was just so sad. And I think other people have related to that in other ways too, of being a kid and, being bullied and things like that. But I feel like kind of embarrassed that I haven't been more of a, I guess, scholar. There's a lot of things that came up in the book where I'm like, oh, when history ended in high school, I didn't pursue this anymore. And I never really looked into the real history of things. And, we all grew up with like the Christopher Columbus story. And I just hadn't gone out of my way to learn a lot about Black history and what really happened. And so I think after reading this book, for me, I would like to read more about history, just so I understand the events that happened in this country that I think I just know like the surface of. Let's see, do I have a message here? Okay. Does anybody want to comment on this? Just general feelings? I'm going to go grab my granola really fast. It's beeping.
I think that's a good point about subtle racism that make up very powerful. That idea, I definitely agree that I think she did a good job of illustrating how one little thing that we might see is actually added to a stack of other very similarly pointed things that makes it understandable of why there's maybe what we would consider like, oh, I didn't think it was that big a deal, and I feel like your reaction is a little bit outsized to a person of color, when for the person of color is like, this is the 18th time in the past 2 weeks that I've had to explain to someone why that is. And I've always thought a little bit, I think we talked about political correctness, that I think unfortunately political correctness has kind of become a little bit of word monitoring instead of, I think the idea is that if you're in the majority culture, if you're white, there's a little bit of a responsibility you have to learn about the impact your words have on other people to prevent kind of some of those subtle little jabs. And if you know a little bit more or have a little bit more empathy, I agree. I think she did a really good job in that way.
Brian Mills, you are next. Oops.
Okay. Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. You know, as I read the book, I guess I naively thought that, like, in the first 4 chapters, she was going to outline like what was wrong with this country, and then we'd move on to how to fix it. And the more you read, the more it's like, man, this isn't so simple that it's just a couple of chapters of here's what's wrong, now let's fix it. It just kind of kept going, and it kept going, and it kept going, and in a way, it was almost defeating reading the book and seeing the examples of racism, and the things that she was calling out that I never thought about, and again, in a way, it felt kind of defeating because there was so much there, and it's like, how do you climb this mountain? How do you tackle this problem? But I guess as if you stop and think about it, then it's like, well, this is the inspiration that you need to make the change, to realize when you do things that they have actions, and to question your privilege, and you know, to call it out. And I guess for me, you know, I obviously when you read the book, you know, it raises more questions, and leaves you in a place where you're like, wow, I have a lot of work to do here. And so for me, that's how I felt, and not in a bad way, but there was a point in the arc of the book where I was like, I don't think I'm going to be able to recover from this. Like, this just doesn't feel like it's going to have a good ending for me. And as I read on, I was like, no, I see what I have to do, question things and make changes in your life. And so I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was, I don't know that I would have read it, you know, with, you know, just by myself. So I'm glad that KIRO put this together and put this out there, because I think it was a fun forum and great way to discuss the topics in the book. But yeah, I guess it just left me saying that there's a lot of work that we as a people need to do, and we as individuals need to do as well.
Did you feel depressed, Brian? Or about the reality of it? Did you feel depressed, or did you feel sort of optimistic about tackling the challenge? Like, now that we're kind of done with it, how do you come out of it feeling?
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's kind of like you've broken out of the prison, and you're like, great, I just have to climb this hill. And then you look at the hill and you're like, oh my God, it's 1.5 miles straight up. And so in a way, it did leave you depressed, but I don't know, just the person I am, when I see something like that, I'm like, no, I got this. And so I felt sort of inspired. You know, it went from being like, man, this is depressing, to we can do this. We can make a change.
I've definitely felt a shift in my head and awareness. I feel like I walk around being a lot more aware and thinking about things more, like thinking before speaking, and just kind of observing the world through a different lens. I think obviously there's like a ton more to do, but I feel a little bit hopeful just because of how fast certain things have moved in the past few weeks. I mean, here in Seattle, having the talk about defunding the police by 50% and having the majority of council be on board for that, you know, seeing the different brands kind of topple, you know, Aunt Jemima and now the Redskins, and just kind of one by one, you know, for whether or not they're doing it from the goodness of their hearts or they're doing it because of money, it's still happening. And, you know, we live in a society that's fueled by money. And so if that's the way you have to get to them, that's the way you have to get to them. But I don't know, it seems like we've seen a lot of change. You know, you can't compare Aunt Jemima to, you know, Breonna Taylor's murderer not being arrested. But I think it's staying in the public conscious. And I feel like people have shifted in a way that we haven't shifted before, at least in my lifetime. Let's see, Christy, you're next.
Hello?
Hi, Christy.
Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you for choosing this book. I thought it was a fantastic read and incredibly appropriate for the time and well facilitated. I love that you preempted things with questions to think about. And it's profoundly changed the way that I function throughout my day. I found myself having exchanges with people that I would not normally have had because of some of the information that was in this book. But like Stephen, I also found it to be somewhat daunting at times. And frankly, I think at times unqualified to have exchanges with people. But I actually would stop and re-listen to the book. I listened to the audio, and I loved it. It was well, I'm not sure how to say it, voiced.
Yeah.
But there were times that I wasn't sure how to feel, but at the end, I loved how she kind of gave people permission to F up and just try again and mess up again and keep going with it. And basically, you know, work things out and let it be kind of a journey. So that's what I took from it. And I loved it. I thought it was just a wonderful book.
Yeah. Excuse me. Back to people's general thoughts if you have one later. The other question that number 2 was about cultural appropriation. And that is something that I find to be so confusing. Like over the years, I've read articles about people being accused of culturally appropriating something. And sometimes I think, yeah. And sometimes I think, really? So I find that one's really hard because I don't think it's as black and white. And, you know, anybody who's here who knows me and has been following me, like in my food obsession, I kind of think about it a lot in the food world because that's a huge thing right now. Like Bon Appetit magazine is kind of doing a lot of restructuring and going back to their recipes where, you know, they took a really traditional dish and then just gave it an easy peasy kind of Monday night fast cooking white people's name and didn't mention, you know, what country the dish came from. And, you know, you can swap in quinoa when it's, you know, not a dish. And so, you know, they're making an effort there. And I don't know, I get confused. Like, for example, several years ago, there's a restaurant in Seattle that was doing what they called a hip hop brunch. And they had a DJ and they were playing hip hop music. And then the food was puns. So it was like, I don't know, like rapper names kind of punned into the breakfast dishes. And the stranger wrote this whole article about how that was appropriating Black culture. And honestly, I didn't really understand that because I just was like, well, can you not play hip hop in your restaurant if you're not a Black owner? They were saying that, you know, they were making money on the backs of these Black artists. And then there's, you know, like one of the most popular Thai restaurants in the country is Pok Pok in Portland, and it's a white owner. And he says that he's a student of Thai food. He's not trying to reinvent the wheel. He's just like making the food that he learned. But is that appropriation because he gets way more press and probably makes a lot more money than Thai people who own Thai restaurants? So I kind of have a hard time navigating and knowing when exactly appropriation is happening and what am I supposed to do? Like, am I supposed to like boycott or not?
I think everyone has a hard time, and I don't think there's any clear-cut rules at all. Certainly, you don't have to be from an ethnic group to cook and be a chef in that medium. I think there is a question, and I think one of the things that I'll hear frequently is people talking about, if you like Thai food, do you only eat at Thai restaurants where it's a white chef? And the other thing that will happen is that oftentimes the sort of upper crust, more expensive restaurants that are ethnic, that cook ethnic foods or cook ethnic cuisine will be run by white people. And that question of, do they take that medium and then it's imbued with some sort of extra value, or then it becomes fine dining? Because I think I think they're all interesting questions to think about and sort through. I think one of the things I try to look at is the variety of places that I'm patronizing, and what the whether they're white owned or whether they're owned by people in the ethnic group of the cuisine that's being cooked. And I think if you are only eating at restaurants with a white owner, but eating a lot of ethnic cuisines, it's something to think about, of being able to, honor's the wrong word, but just that an opportunity to broaden your experience. And I think it is valuable to patronize businesses that are owned by people outside your own, outside of the dominant white ethnic group.
Yeah, I was on not Food Network, the Cooking Channel, a show several years ago where they came to Seattle for some reason to highlight Mexican food, which I was surprised about because it's not really our specialty. But they were asking me, where should we go to eat? And I named off a few places, and they said, we can't go there because that person has an accent, or it was like, so they basically picked white-run Mexican places, and it was so bad. But I when I say I understand, it's like I understand why they said that, because they want to have somebody speaking really clear English on their TV show, but also it's like, what about subtitles? What about a translator? Like, really? And so I think things like that is where there's definitely a problem.
Yeah. Somebody asked about Taco Bell. Yeah, I think Taco Bell's safe. The only problem is if it's Taco Bell with a Kentucky Fried Chicken attached, like the hybrid, wearing the same thing, like that's an abomination. Like you can't patronize those. Like they have to be separate.
Nothing wrong with that. Mike Sievers, you're up next.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Yeah, I think it is a confusing topic, and I think the rap example she gave in the book might be kind of a tricky one, because I don't know if it's the best example, because the pop charts have been dominated by Black rappers for seems like a couple of decades now. It seems to me that some of the more confusing stuff, or some of the more obvious examples, are like Disney making their billions of dollars on, the Mauna movie.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, Rachel and I were in a conversation with a friend a few years ago about Halloween costumes based on that, like little white girls dressing up as Mauna, or I haven't seen the movie, but it's like a Polynesian character. And I think those examples are a little easier for me to understand. It's like, okay, if you're sort of siphoning off what's cool about a culture and making a lot of money off of it without honoring or benefiting that culture, that's where we might be able to do better. Or like, if you are kind of making fun, like I think the Halloween costume thing gets to like less appreciation and more sort of caricature,
Yeah.
And so, but it's, I agree with Danny that it's like, it is tough to find a hard line or a rule to follow. Maybe it's case by case.
Yeah, with the costumes, I think a good general rule of thumb, and maybe, but dressing as a historical figure or a specific person is definitely different than dressing as a culture. like that dressing as someone from a specific group is problematic, but dressing as a specific person is more acceptable. It's never cool to paint your face like that. That you should never change the tone. But like Rachel mentioned, the Bon Appetit, and their editor ended up resigning, and part of the reason was there was a picture that was taken of him at a Halloween party where he was dressed up. It was in New York to look Puerto Rican. And then there was a whole debate about, he's saying like, I didn't actually put any paint on my face. That was my normal face tone. It wasn't brown. There was a whole deal about that. But I think the general rule that I've always been told is that dressing as a culture for Halloween is definitely falls into the appropriation category.
I'm going to skip down to question 5, because I think that this is something that I have struggled the most with personally, and something that I changed my mind the most about. That's the chapter where she's talking about, are you a Martin or are you a Malcolm? And she's talking about the different styles of Martin Luther King versus, oh my gosh, I just blanked.
Malcolm X.
Thank you, Malcolm X. Like, where's my notes? And the idea of being more of a peaceful, loving presence and being more of a louder, more, quote, aggressive presence. And I remember, years ago, I don't know now, 5-6 years ago, if anybody remembers, it was in Westlake Center. It was when Bernie Sanders came, and he was having a rally there. And this was the first that I'd ever heard of the Black Lives Matter movement. These 2 women that rushed the stage and grabbed the mic and, disrupted the rally, and they were talking about Black Lives Matter. And I remember at that time, I was like, that's not how you do it. Not going to get anybody on your side interrupting this rally in any way. Bernie Sanders is the most liberal person, so why are you doing it at his rally? And talking about that with friends, and we all agreed, like, if you want people to listen to you, you have to come to them in like a nice way. And I held on to that for a long time, and it wasn't until this movement, with reading more and understanding of people saying, we've been quiet and nice for a really long time, and that does not work. And you have to be louder, and you have to be, I don't want to use the words pushier and aggressive because they're negative, but you're not being nice and polite. And so reading that was a good chapter for me to read, because that's something that I have to keep being reminded of over and over again, is that especially for Black people, I have never experienced that experience, and they have the right to speak out however they want and to protest however they want. And for me, 5 or 6 years ago, to say that was the wrong way, I realize now that is not my business. I suppose, like, I can't tell anybody how they should do it, and they were making change and I wasn't. I was just talking about it, and they were the ones doing something about it. And I'm just curious if other people feel uncomfortable. This came up when George Floyd died, and all of the protests started, and in downtown Seattle, there was a lot of glass being broken and looting, and whether that had to do with the protest or not, if that was just people who came out to do looting. I definitely, at first, after hearing the Mayor of Atlanta say, everybody go home, I was like, yeah, everybody stop doing this. It's too violent. It's too destructive. And it took me like a day or two to keep reading other people saying, that's a building, they have insurance, you can clean up the glass, but you can't do the same for a human life. And kind of putting in perspective that I don't stand for violence, and I don't think those buildings should have been destroyed, but if that's what it takes, this is something I'm just wrestling with. And so hearing her kind of talk about those two people was really useful for me.
Really, that question and that difference that you just talked about, Rachel, and that she outlines pretty well. We had a really heated moment on my show yesterday. I host a sports show in the mornings, and it went on for about a half hour. I was actually interested if people in this group were interested in listening to it. I could send out a link later because it was a debate about the strategy and target of protests by NFL players. And I ended up getting pretty mad because of what my co-host was saying, which was basically that the NFL players should be focused more on some of the expressions of anti-Semitism among Black players than as in addition to just focusing on issues of justice for Breonna Taylor. And I felt like it fell into that you're telling a Black man how to protest. You're telling him what his political priorities should be, and that's that's kind of the wrong way to go about things. Like it's not our place as white people to advise someone on what their political priorities should be and how they would, but that gets into a space too where you kind of give up, I guess, a little bit of control over the methods that are used or the way it's expressed. And it does feel uncomfortable. It certainly was an uncomfortable conversation yesterday.
Let's see. Krista wants to comment. Stephen, if you wouldn't mind opening up Krista's mic.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. What you're saying really resonates with me. Sorry, I'm on a walk, so I'm walking and talking. I've been having conversations with my coworkers about all of this. And this is the one thing that really keeps coming up is my coworkers are like fairly progressive and open-minded, it seems like, but they seem to be really comfortable denouncing violence. Like, hey, I support the protesters, but I don't support the looting and I don't support the violence. And so I said something similar to what you said, Rachel, was as a white person, I don't feel like I'm in a place to criticize how someone reacts to hundreds of years of terrorism. I don't have a right to comment on that. And where's the priority? If we're talking about, just like you said, if we're talking about buildings being looted or merchandise being stolen versus human lives, like we should be focusing on the human lives here and not denouncing the way that someone chooses to protest when things haven't changed quickly enough. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting how often that is coming up. And that's why I wanted to comment is just, I'm having that conversation with folks of like, wait a minute, like let's hold back our criticism and really listen to the message and what needs to be heard here. And of course, you know, it's complicated because there are people who are opportunistic, right? There are white people who are looting too. And it's like, come on,
yeah,
that's ridiculous. But the, you know, the larger point being, if there's violence, if there's protesting, we have to listen to the message that's trying to be communicated and where that's coming from.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, it's not black and white because it's, you know, if you say that you've come to the conclusion that, you know, they can do whatever they need to do, people assume then that you're pro-violence or you're pro-looting, and it's like, well, no, you know, in a perfect world, I wouldn't want that to happen, but if that's what it takes to get to a better place, you know, it's like, it's just not a cut and dry opinion.
Right.
Yeah, just like someone just wrote in the comments, can I be upset with the damage and looting and supportive of the protests?
Yeah. Yes. I don't think that those are two mutually exclusive things. I think assigning the damage to the protests is something that I don't think you can know that for sure, that it was the protesters. It was social unrest, and certainly the protests bled into that. But yeah, I think the riots are scary and cause damage. Martin Luther King Jr., I just pasted in, it's a 2-part quote in there, but he had that the riots are the language of the oppressed, and there is a function that it's needs of people that are not being met, and they come out in that sort of violent expression. But yeah, I looked at the damage, and you feel it's awful and really costly, and that the reaction that caused caused people to feel that way, that's part of the problem we need to fix too, not just say, well, if people just would have asked nicer, we would have done it.
Mm-hmm. And now, especially with how much exposure because of camera phones, we're seeing all of the police violence. I mean, in Seattle, so much police. I mean, these videos make me sick. Just, Brian, my boyfriend's on here. He showed me a video. It was like, you weren't supposed to cross the line. It was just people standing there doing nothing, and police just, pummeled them. And so there was something in the book, and Mike Sievers just pointed this out in the comments, where it's like, the social contract has already been broken. If you're a Black person and you have either been the victim of police violence, or somebody, or you've seen a lot of it, why would you think that if that contract's already been broken, why would you think that you can't be violent in a different way when you need something? Yeah, that's been one of the hardest parts about this whole movement to me, is to watch this police violence when people aren't doing anything. I mean, it's just horrific.
It's a hard question. I'd never thought about defunding the police before this.
No.
That's actually one of the books that I'm reading next, is kind of about policing. I don't think I know enough about that issue. But that idea that I guess maybe saying it, doubling back to the riots things, I think we need to look at not just saying that the protests lead to riots, but that sort of the urgency of the emotions, that the underlying social situation, that's part of the things we need to look at solving as well, rather than just saying this was a matter of misbehavior. That there's something in the structure of our society that's causing that kind of anger to come out and be expressed in that destructive of a way.
Yeah, and the question number 6 kind of meshes in with what we were just talking about, which she calls tone policing. So that's kind of the same thing, but for conversations, is, like what I was kind of saying was like, couldn't you just say that in a different way? Which, okay, so I've never said that to a Black person, but I have a white friend who is very active on social media right now with everything that's going on in the world, and she's trying to fight everybody. And I recently kind of had this conversation with her because she was so frustrated. Like, why are people deleting me from social media? Why are they blocking me? And I suggested that she came at it a little bit differently. And I don't know if that means I was tone policing her or not. Is it tone policing also if it's to a white person? I don't know. In my mind, I was thinking, I think more people would listen to you if you didn't come in and you weren't so angry at the beginning. Try to have a conversation first. But when I was reading that, I was like, oh, maybe I'm the tone police.
I think that's a fair conversation to have, Rachel. I think it is different when it's with a white person. I think some of it is like, what's the goal you want to have? Like, what are you trying to accomplish?
That's what I said to her.
Yeah. What do you want? Do you want to create understanding? The internet's overall a fairly terrible way to do that now. Like, if anybody's met the internet, like, the internet is awful. Like, the internet is the worst behaved person you've ever been around.
Yeah.
So you can go on there for like this sort of play. I call it pro wrestling, where everybody just gets up there and postures and like, oh, I'm going to drop this insult on you, and then you're going to punch me back. And some people like that. But that question of what goal is, but yeah, generally asking someone from a different group, or someone who is Black to moderate the way that they express themselves is going to fall into that tone policing. I have told one of my Black friends told me though that the two things that she likes to see online is that when what she called it, white people clean up their own trash, which is if there's a white person acting out or being an overall ass, especially to a person of color, to call them out on that. And she was like, and we're all for tone policing other white people if they're being rude or if they're being aggressive or being antagonistic to people of color, which I thought was interesting. I was like, oh, I get to be tone policed to other white people? I don't know about that.
Well, I've been doing it, and it's take it from me. It actually, the conversation went well. But like, it was interesting because she was upset that her family didn't want to have these conversations she wanted them to have, but she was telling them exactly when she wanted to have the conversations and how they needed to have them. And so I don't know, I just kind of felt like you have to let people come to things on their own time. You can't force someone to watch a documentary or talk to you about this right now. Like, I don't know. I think in some cases with white people, there are good and bad ways to have a discussion and not come out and insult somebody right away.
Mm-hmm. So, comment from Brian, read an article where someone said that something along the lines that there's not a single thing that has ever been invented that has done more to protect Black lives and advance racial justice than the camera phone.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think that there's some truth to that. It's interesting though how long we've had those, because I remember very clearly the Rodney King case. Like I remember what it was like to watch the video. I remember where I was when the acquittals came out. Like I was going out on a date with Jennifer Crouch that night. I think I was a junior in high school. Yeah, because it was 92. And I remember when I saw the video, kind of everybody thinking and talking about, oh, these allegations that have happened. Like there's proof that this actually happens and that there's no way that you can deny that this happens anymore. And I remember that feeling, and like, it's kind of like 30 years later, the conversation is advanced, but we're still essentially having a lot of the same conversation of see it's happening. And it's taken an awful lot of video to get us to that point as a country. Rodney King fed into the belief that there were a few bad apples. Yeah, that's probably true. Because it wasn't a series of videos. It was one video that we saw that kind of got recorded by happenstance. It wasn't like everybody has a video camera in their pocket now. Oh, actually, I'm into the question about the trend of people being proud that they've been deleted by friends on social media. That's an interesting trend. I don't know entirely how I feel about that. That if it's a goal to sort of draw a line between someone you won't associate with anymore. I know earlier this year, it was right after when President Trump first started referring to coronavirus as the Chinese virus. And there were a couple things that had happened here. And I decided, I posted on my Twitter account, I said, if anybody's insisting on calling it the Chinese virus, please let me know so I can block you. Which I kind of thought was, if you're going to be adamant about your right to use that, I don't want to interact with you, and I don't want you to even passively consume anything that I have to produce. I don't want to say I have mixed thoughts about that, because I feel pretty strongly about that. But I don't know if that's always the best way to go with this. I think shame's effective, but I'm not sure about shunning people or feeling proud about that, because there's a little bit like we shouldn't be centering how we feel so much as the people who are more directly affected by the racism. I think as part of being an ally, that it's not about us standing up on as high a soapbox, maybe like I'm doing right now, as about being an advocate for other people.
Yeah, I mean, I know that the internet is the wave of the future and the present, but I personally just refuse to have talks about this with people because it's just not a good way to communicate. I mean, it's the same like with my friends. If my feelings are hurt, I don't text with them about it. We talk on the phone. And, you know, with your partner, you tend to like have serious conversations in person. And so I just don't engage in that way, because people just don't act like they would if you were on the phone with them or if you were in person. And so I've just chosen to remove myself completely, because it doesn't really ever lead to anything good. And it makes me so mad that I feel this feeling in my body, and then there's no release, because you don't have a release with them that you can at the end say, okay, well, I guess we don't agree, but let's still be friends and walk away. Like, I don't know. I just think it's the worst possible medium to have these conversations.
Yeah. Brian pointing out, and Krista as well, that the block culture only digs the deeper divide between us and them.
Yeah.
I think those things are true. I will add the one thing that complicates this for anybody that spends a significant amount of time online, whether it's on Twitter, especially on Twitter, but other places, is the actual trolls. Like when you have people that are not interested in a good faith debate, and I think that this is what accentuates like the sort of blocking culture, is that there are people who they're not looking for an exchange of ideas. They've got a specific approach that they're going to use to try to get your goat or to waste your time, or all of these different strategies. So it can create, there's no, in my experience, there's very little to be gained from interacting with those people, and you are better off blocking them. The problem is that does actually, for people whose minds could be changed, or for people that you could positively interact with, or maybe explain to them the perspective that you're coming from, it can make it harder to do that, because if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck but doesn't happen to be a troll, it's a little different.
I'm interested in a couple of these comments. So Krista wrote, I've been thinking a lot about how to bring people along, knowing that once I was very ignorant. I don't know if you want to speak more to that, Krista. I'm curious to know what your methods are, because I think that was why I did my tone policing, was kind of for that reason, to my white friend, was to kind of be like, if you really want to bring people along, you have to kind of be a little bit compassionate and be on their level. And you can't expect them to be as, quote, woke as you are. Like, that's, everyone's at different stages. But I'm curious if anybody has anyone in their life that is really important to them, who has a totally different perspective, and how you do try to like bring them along gently, or how you handle those relationships. Because I don't know, I have a friend I was walking with this weekend, and she found out that her stepbrother, she knew he voted for Trump last election, but she was appalled that after everything she feels Trump has done while in office, that he would vote for him again. And she is on the verge of not wanting to talk to him ever again. And that's not her personality. And these things are so hard. It's like eliminating a family member, but it's like deep morals and values. So I'm just curious if anybody has had any successful navigation through, a family member or a close friend who has really different politics, or something that just is really upsetting to you, that you've managed to figure it out a little bit. Let's see. Linda said, the method I use is to say, that comment is an ouch for me, and I'd like to share why. Then I say why. It's always been well received and listened to. Yeah, I guess in that way, you're like, they can't argue with your feelings. If you're saying that you feel hurt by something, someone can't argue with the way that you feel. I mean, they can, but my therapist said they can't.
You're allowed to have your feelings.
Yeah.
I've just been thinking a lot about how it's much easier to just shame someone or block someone. Like, it would be much easier for me to just say you're wrong and just yell at someone and vent at someone. It's harder, but like possibly more effective to try to meet someone where they are and try to understand. And at a few weeks ago, right after George Floyd's murder, I had a couple of friends engage me online on Facebook with like kind of all lives matter kind of sentiment. And it really, I have this, like you were talking about, Rachel, this visceral reaction, and it's like, I get all tensed up, but I thought, how can I respond to this in a way that might make them think? Because if I just yell at them, they're probably going to get defensive. They're probably going to just get more entrenched in whatever their views are. And I don't know if that will really help them to bring them along and help them to try to see my point of view and try to see why I think that statement is problematic. And so I thought a lot about it, and I engaged with them in a way. And I also said, kind of echoing what you said, Rachel, I said in one of my comments, I don't think that online is a great way to engage in deep discussions about this. And it was like an acquaintance, and I said, please give me a call if you want to talk more about this. And so I don't know, that might be a strategy to use with someone who you have some kind of relationship with. And she didn't call me. I don't know if it was really effective, but I was really trying to engage and help someone to see. And I said, I was like, I used to think that way too, because, you know, I've learned a lot in my life, and I grew up very conservative and very religious, and I just didn't have the perspective on the world that I have now. And so I try to be compassionate towards someone who maybe hasn't had the understanding or the exposure that I have been able to have to bring me to where I am now.
I think you make a really good point about all you can do is offer.
Yeah.
Krista, I think that's, I agree with you. I think those conversations are very difficult to have online. Trying to get a person to think about it from a different perspective is really the ultimate goal, or the way that you're hoping to accomplish. So different questions of, well, have you thought about, or can you see how that might look from someone else's perspective? Like something that tries to get that person to actually think about it from someone else's point of view, but it requires good faith, and it requires a willingness on that other person's part. In general, I don't think the complete shutdown of dialogue and saying like this is over, like is a healthy thing. And certainly online just makes that more complicated, because you have bad actors mixed in there too.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to revisit from last week, it was the part of the conversation that stuck out to me the most was another Mike who was in the first two meetings. He was talking about that he tried something new, that he was driving down the street and he had seen that there was a Black person pulled over. And so he pulled over to just kind of monitor. And then somebody else said, ooh, we were going to do that, but we didn't. And it was the conversation of, I feel uncomfortable because I don't want to come off as a white hero, or I just feel uncomfortable in general because what am I just standing there on the street watching? It's very odd. And I feel like she addressed that a little bit in the end chapter of the book, or maybe it was the last two chapters, where she did say to, you know, help and stick up for a Black person who looked like they needed it, but to not make it worse for them. So to kind of, you know, not force a situation where then that Black person might end up being more of a victim, or, you know. So yeah, I don't know how that addresses like the pulling over, but I guess, I would imagine in most cases people might appreciate your interest and they could tell you if they don't want it, or you just have to take the social cues. Did anybody else from, I wish I didn't write down, like I take all these notes and I didn't write down exactly where that was, but wondering if anybody else was reading that, thinking of last week's conversation, saying, oh, that makes it a little more clear for me.
I did think about that, and I guess one of the, in coming across that part, is that we've talked a lot about empathy and trying to take your cues from the person of color, and not necessarily getting offended on their behalf or trying to look good in their eyes, but trying to read how they're reacting to the situation just in a conversation. And maybe the same with a law enforcement situation. If it's a peaceful conversation, trying to look at how that interaction is going to decide, and that you're always free to stop, but trying to take the cues from that person, so you're not making the situation worse. You're not increasing the suspicion on that person. That was what I thought, is that try to sense or look at and try to interpret what that person might be feeling in that moment, or what they're trying to communicate to you, even if they're not talking to you.
And Jane G said, I actually spoke to my Black friend about that topic. She thought that would be helpful, and maybe it's just being there as a witness and stepping in when necessary, letting them know they aren't alone. We have about 5 minutes left. One thing, it was page 182 that struck, one of the personal stories that really stood out to me was Ijeoma's son not wanting to say the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, it's just amazing. I don't have children and I'm not around children that much, so I forget how smart they can be. You know, you're like, oh, he's 8 years old and he has, you know, his own ideas and he knows the words of the Pledge of Allegiance and he doesn't believe in it. And the thing that struck out to me though was, unless I forgot, because I have a bad memory, I don't remember ever being taught what the Pledge of Allegiance really was and going through it line by line. And it is odd to have children stand up and say this thing that they don't know what it is. I mean, I'm sure everyone when they're a kid, you know, the words run together and it's like injustice for all, like these words, I didn't even know what I was saying because I thought it was different words. And reading that about her son and having this realization at 4 years old, like, it is crazy that it says God in the Pledge of Allegiance. What about the separation of church and state? And it reminded me of the Juanita High School rebel mascot debate, because one of the students told me, we don't learn about US history till our junior year. People don't even know what a rebel is. So I feel like there's just a level of education that needs to happen if we're all going to like live in this America and we're all going to say the pledge and we're all going to do this. Like, they need to kind of teach us about it so that we can decide if it's something we want or not. They wait so long to teach us about US history, and in elementary school, all you're doing is making a turkey out of your hand and, you know, oh, the Pilgrims came to America. I mean, these stories that they tell us, it's just, you don't learn until, you may never learn what really happened. So that kind of education, I think is so important. So again, reiterating of myself wanting to read more history next. So I can be as smart as Ijeoma Oluo's 8-year-old son.
Yeah, I never put that much thought into it. I don't think it would have helped if they'd waited until high school either. Like, I would have never been that cognizant enough.
No. But if you're someone who felt like the pledge didn't represent you,
I know.
you felt left out of that, which is something I never felt.
Right.
I mean,
like,
it's totally different. It's like, oh, this doesn't apply to me, but we all have to say it.
Yeah, all of those rites and rituals that I'm like, that's never impacted me negatively. Like, I've only ever thought like that was sort of a step that we took, we went through to go about a given day. And yeah, like all of the different, like how many of those things mean something profoundly different to people that are identified differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, any final comments from anyone as we get ready to wrap up? I know that I've gotten a few emails since we started this from people saying, oh, I wish we were having more meetings, or I hope that the group doesn't end. And so I'm just curious what people want after this. And I said the first time I was going to send out a survey and I didn't. That's because it was about times. And I was like, it's just easier if we just make a time ourselves. But I do want to send a survey and just see what people are interested in, whether it's something like having our own Facebook group where people can, you know, exchange ideas and say, hey, I read this book, and share resources. Or if you do want to pick a different book, whether that's a book like this or just a piece of fiction written by a Black person that we all want to discuss. You know, I'm just curious if people want to have a continuing engagement in some way, whether it's more passive or more connected, like I feel that this is. So I'll put a survey together and send it out and just see what you all are interested in, if anything. And if not, if this was, you know, just enough for you, that's totally fine. Danny, you got to send that link. People want that link. We want to hear it out.
Yeah, because it's interesting because I've been very affected by it for the past 2 days. And I think some of that is sort of there's certainly some anger on my part, but also the kind of question of, I felt like it was a real-time experience of a lot of the different conversations that we've had, and that balance of trying to be respectful of someone else but feeling very strongly that they were expressing an opinion that was muting or attempting to undermine the justice, the motive for justice. I'd very much be interested, and I'm not someone who is sensitive to criticism. I'd be interested, I will send the link out. I'd be interested for anybody's thoughts, even if that they think I was an ass, which is possible, because I can be, and what they thought, because I'm still not sure how I feel about it, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I'm curious, because when the few debates that I've gotten into with people who, it's interesting, just like you think that you kind of have more similar beliefs, and you're like, whoa, I think I get really nervous because I'm afraid that I might not know enough, and I don't know how to express it always. It's just like, but I feel this way and I don't know how. Like, do you get those kind of nerves or do you feel like confident enough that you know your beliefs that you can express them well?
I get mad, and one of the I have a temper and I don't hide it well. So people, and there are times I'll look more mad than I am, which it can make the other person feel even more defensive. Like that, if there's one thing I could change about my debate stance, is that if I do get mad, like that becomes very evident to everyone. I kind of become hyper articulate. Like I become I start talking faster and sharper. And I'll interrupt
humble brag
people.
if I've ever heard one.
What?
When I get mad, I get so articulate.
No, like, because I start speaking really like sharp. It's not a compliment. It's not a compliment at all. I'm not eloquent at all. Like I become like a woodpecker. Like it's just, and it's, you guys will hear it. It's because I get mad in it. And it's not great. And like I said, I still don't know quite how to feel about it. I know where my heart was. I don't know how well I executed what my intention was, though.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Well, it's 8:05. Thank you so much. I'll be sending an email out, if not this week, next week, with a survey. And yeah, thanks again. We love that you joined us. It is so refreshing and just so nice to see so many people engaged, and just to be here. It means that you care and that you really want to make an effort. And I don't know, I'm not as articulate as Danny right now because I'm
not mad. So now I'm just a dopey, like wandering around. This has been one of the more encouraging and heartful things for me in a period of time that, because I spend a lot of time online, has been very, very hard for me. I want to thank each and every one of you for being part of the discussion. And it's been really cool. And I've appreciated it a great deal.
And doing it with people that you don't know has a benefit that I didn't anticipate, because sometimes when you talk with your friends, you all agree and you just go round and round. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know where everyone here lives. Everybody has a different background. And so I think that it's useful, and it's a good way to practice being vulnerable, talking about really personal or hard things with people that you don't know. I think that really expands and opens the heart in general.
Yeah. And for an extrovert like me in COVID and the quarantine, not being around, I am desperate for social interaction. So I've been grateful for that as well.
Yeah. Cool. Well, have a good night, everybody. And we'll have something coming up. So this won't be goodbye. It'll be see you later.